You want to feel old? It's been 18 years since the U.S. military overthrew the Taliban. Since then, hundreds of thousands of American troops have passed through Afghanistan. 2,300 of them died there. Over and over, government and military leaders told us the war in Afghanistan was making progress, and we just needed to stay the course. We couldn't pull out. Now, newly released documents show they were lying repeatedly. Officials distorted statistics in order to conceal from the public what was happening, which was, in effect, a disaster. Hundreds of billions of dollars were spent. How much did we spend? We spent more than the entire Marshall Plan after inflation. And it was all wasted trying to modernize Afghanistan's tribal society. Medieval doesn't even describe it. Military leaders didn't know what their objective was. They didn't know who the enemy was a lot of the time. They would admit that to each other, but they never admitted it in public to the people who were paying for the war or dying fighting in it. So what happened to the people who did this, who prosecuted this disaster and misled you about it? Now, if you did that, if you orchestrated an orgy of waste and incompetence on this scale, you'd be in jail. You certainly wouldn't have a paying job. The people behind this debacle, they're still running the show at the Pentagon, or they're being richly rewarded as lobbyists or running think tanks, or they're defense contractors, because no one is ever punished. Margin of Victory author and retired U.S. Army Colonel Douglas Macgregor has been warning the public about the futility of what's happening in Afghanistan for a decade. And we have video proof right here, all the way from 2010. Watch this.
Before I let you go, should we be spending $1 trillion in the Islamic world to import democracy?
No, absolutely not. It's a dead end. It's a hopeless endeavor.
Hopeless endeavor.
Absolutely. This is a bottomless pit for our resources. Nothing good is going to come out of it.
If only we'd listened, but we didn't. Doug Macgregor joins us tonight. Colonel, thanks so much for coming on.
Sure.
So what we learned is what we kind of suspected, that the people in charge were lying to us. That happens a lot. What I'm amazed by is how no one's ever punished. So the people who lied to us about this disaster, where are they now?
Well, first, before we go over some ugly things, which we're going to have to do this segment, I want to say, go Army, beat Navy.
Yes.
120th game on Saturday. I'm a West Point graduate. I want to see the Army win.
I think that's important.
That's right. Now, set that aside. First of all, we learned that very little has changed in the senior ranks of the U.S. Army and probably of the Marines since the Vietnam period. We're dealing with the same sort of people who set aside the truth in favor of pleasant fiction, and at the time were rewarded with promotion for doing so. That's the first thing. Secondly, we need to remember that President Trump, in July of 2017, gathered his cabinet, brought in all of his advisors, and said, I want to leave Afghanistan immediately. I want out. And everyone who had any service in the military, uniformed or otherwise, all closed ranks and said, you can't leave. If you leave, the world as we know it will end. And we're making progress. No, we need to send more troops. We need to double down. In other words, the same routine that went on with President Obama. Ultimately, we know the rest of the story. There was no one who could walk in who had any military background or experience and tell the president the truth. You're right, Mr. President. We need to cut our losses, as any good businessman knows, and get out before more good soldiers, sergeants, lieutenants, captains, colonels, warrant officers are killed. It didn't happen. Now, what about the generals that brought us this tragedy? Where are they? Well, some of them are now retired. In fact, I noted just before I came in here that David Petraeus is pushing back and says, I stand by everything I said. So either he's lying about what happened at the time, or he's just delusional, because we know from the report that others who were there on the ground who were not generals were saying, look, this is a disaster. It's not working. President Trump has an opportunity right now to drain the military swamp. Go after the senior officers who are on active duty right now who played a role in this. And interestingly enough, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Milley, is prominently featured in these papers. He's one of those who kept saying, no, the police, the Army, the Afghan forces, they're doing a great job. We're making progress, when that was absolutely untrue. I think if he was invited to retire, that would send a very positive message to the rest of the force. Lying doesn't pay anymore.
If you raised your children the way that Washington treats its policymakers, where there's no penalty whatsoever for dishonesty, you would raise sociopaths.
Yes.
Yeah, and that's what we're doing. Colonel, thank you so much, as always, for your clarity. I appreciate it.
Okay.